Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2020 Bibliometrics and Research Assessment Symposium. My name is Chris Belter, and along with Yaling Liu, I'm one of the event co-hosts for our 3-day event. I want to welcome you all back to the session. I think we had a really great day 1. We had a lot of really great discussions, both in the Slack channels and also here in the chat. Hopefully we can continue that momentum here today. It's great to see so many of you joining the session, so I'm looking forward to today's events. Before we get started, I've just got a couple of quick announcements that I wanted to make in case you haven't joined us before. We are recording this particular session, and we are going to be recording all of the sessions in the future. But be aware that we're not recording the attendees or the chat boxes, so feel free to continue participating, knowing that you're not going to be part of any recording that we're making. The audio for attendees is in broadcast mode only, so there's no need for you to join the audio sessions. You should just be able to hear us through your computer. All attendees are going to be muted and will remain muted for the duration of the event. So if you have any questions, either technical questions or questions for our speakers, please use the chat box to get in touch with us, and please send your messages to everyone. We do have a number of folks who are monitoring the chat as we go, so please send your messages to everyone so that way our chat monitors can actually see it and will be able to respond to you either in chat or to our presenters. Finally, we do have live captions available for this and all future sessions. Those captions are available in the multimedia viewer panel in the lower right of your WebEx screen, or they're also available at the URL that's available in the Slack channel and will be posted in the chat shortly. So with that, I am going to transition now into our first session. So I would like to give a brief introduction to our first keynote speaker, Cassidy Sugimoto. So Cassidy is a professor of informatics at the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University, Bloomington. Her research focuses on the ways in which knowledge is produced, disseminated, and rewarded, with a particular interest in issues of diversity and inclusion. She has edited and authored several books, the most recent of which, Measuring Research, What Everyone Needs to Know, is a primer for those new to Scientometrics. She is actively involved in teaching and service and has been recognized in these areas with an Indiana University Trustees Teaching Award and a National Service Award from the Association for Information Science and Technology. She is also, if that weren't enough, currently serving as the president of the International Society for Scientometrics and Informatics. Cassidy, are you there?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I just want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me and to say how heartened I am by the attention to disparities of science in this event. Dr. Gadd's keynote yesterday raised the issue of diversity in the relationship to our research evaluation systems. She also questioned the effect of the pandemic on certain populations. And these are both topics that I will cover today. Later today, there are also sessions on race and gender, and I encourage you all to attend these. So I'm delighted to kick this off. I'd also like to say how delighted I am to see so many of our former MLS students in the attendee list today. I'm grateful to have had such fabulous students, and it's always nice to see how they've assumed leadership roles within the profession and to come and meet together with them as colleagues. So welcome to everyone, but particularly my fabulous students. So today's talk is going to focus on a few of the things that drive my research agenda, if I can make the slides advance. There we go. So I like to look at who has a voice in science. That is, who gets to make science, who gets to talk about science, who gets to ask science questions. And when they ask them, what kind of labor do they do? And how do certain scientists from certain populations do certain kinds of labor? How are they rewarded for that labor? And does it matter? And this comes up a lot when I'm discussing disparities in science. People say, well, does it matter whose hands are on the pipette? Does it matter who's running the analysis? How does that really change what we know about the world? So I hope to cover at least a few of all of these during the course of today's talk. So I'll start with Foucault's famous question in his essay, What is an Author?, where he asked, what does it matter who is speaking? And in the realm of scholarly communications, this matters a lot. The authorship, that is, appearing on the byline of a scholarly paper, is the coin of the realm. This is what runs the reward system of science and allows you to move forward in sort of all of these cumulative evaluation metrics that have been talked about throughout the course of this symposium. Now, of course, there's a Janus-based nature to this reward system. On one side, there are rewards, on the other side, responsibilities. And I think tomorrow's talk, which will deal with issues of fraud and reproducibility and other issues of the mismanagement of science, deal with the other side of that coin that often doesn't get enough attention. Now, if we look at that coin as it's distributed by gender across the world, we see a very stark picture of disparities. What we've looked at here is the female-to-male productivity by country in terms of authorships. The more blue the country is, the more male authorships, the more orange, the more female authorship. And as you can see, it is a very blue world. The only countries where we see females dominating in production are those that have relatively low resource capacity, many cases of brain drain, where men have left the country for other reasons, and lower investment in science generally. Now, if we take all of the variables that we can get on the country level and we run a big regression on them, the biggest predictor of female dominance in science is male mortality. Now, that's not exactly a policy-relevant implication. There's nothing that we can do about this. And this speaks to a very important point that we see across these studies, is the parity paradox. Sometimes we think that getting to parity is the answer. If only we have 50-50, or if even we have a little overproduction of women, that would be a good thing. But in many cases, it's signs of a vacuum in science that is being filled by women rather than an equitable system. So it's really important throughout all of this to realize that parity is not equal to equity, and that in many cases, when we see parity, it's actually an indication of an imbalance in the system. And so we need to think of other ways of moving towards an equitable scientific system that doesn't just look at the representation in it in terms of diversity, but also looks at inclusion and fairness in the system. Now, you may say, well, you used Web of Science data, and that's skewed towards certain disciplines, and maybe those countries are just overproducing. So we can look at different disciplines. And you see that there's male dominance in math and physics and chemistry. We start to see a few more women coming into the biomedical sciences and the social sciences, and then becoming male-dominated in the humanities. But again, those countries where we see, those disciplines where we see a female dominance are largely care disciplines, nursing, social work, education, librarianship. And those disciplines we often have lower pay. We often have different inequities that pull into things that are related with care, related with domesticity, which perpetuate some of these inequalities in the labor market. As many of you may have seen, studies that look at equal kinds of labor done by men and women with different labels. A janitor, which is typically a male job, gets paid more than a housekeeper, which is typically a female job. And we see this in computation. When women were serving as computers, the salaries were highly depressed. As soon as men entered in greater numbers, the salaries raised. So again, we have some of that imbalance here. Even in those disciplines where we're seeing greater parity, we're not necessarily seeing equity. Now, we can also see differences in the way science is done by men and women within countries. So what you see here is the proportion of articles that are written in national collaboration versus international collaboration. Now, as you would expect in smaller countries like the Philippines or Switzerland or Belgium, you have a higher proportion in international collaboration. In larger countries with greater resource capacity like the United States and China, you see greater degrees of national collaboration. But what is fascinating is invariant of the country size and their domestic profile, women's work is more likely to be domestically co-authored, whereas men's is going to include foreign co-authors. And this has huge implications for the system of science, your access to different networks, your ability to engage in a global conversation around science is going to be mitigated by gender. Now, there are many explanations that we can think of this, particularly social explanations in terms of caregiving, both for elder care, for child care, but also just the general mobility of female scientists. So one of the things that we have done is looked at those mobility rates using their publication records. So if we look at a publication record and we look at changes in affiliation, we can identify two kinds of mobility. One we call travelers. Now, travelers are scientists that always retain one country in it. So, for example, I might have the United States on all of my publications. But then every so often I add on a visiting professorship or another kind of appointment that I have without losing my connection to my country of origin. So I might add on South Africa or the Netherlands. And that would be an indication that I am traveling, but not necessarily migrating. Whereas for migrants, how we define this bibliometrically is we look at things that have severed ties with their origin country. So I was in the United States for a period of time, and then all of my affiliations were in China for the next 5 years. And now if we look at both of those forms of mobility, we see that men are more likely to be mobile in both cases than women in all disciplines. So again, this has implications for the ability for women to network with the global scientific community. This has severe implications for the reward system of science. Now, if we look at your average citations received by men and by women, we find that the worst possible combination is to be a woman writing alone. Those receive the fewest degree of citations. Now, when we move to national collaboration, all collaboratively authored papers, on average, receive more citations than single-authored things. But in each case, when we have a dominant female position, either in a first or a last authored position, those papers are cited on average less than male papers with first or last male authors. Now, international collaboratively authored papers also receive more citations than domestically collaborative papers. But even in that case, we see the same thing, where women in dominant positions have lower citation rates than men in dominant positions. Now, you may say, well, but you're looking at averages, and we know that citations are highly skewed, so averages really aren't the right way to look at this. And also, maybe women are just not placing their work in the right venues. If women were just publishing in Science and Nature and PNAS, they would be getting cited. Maybe their work's just not as good, right? And that becomes an argument that people pull. So one of the things that we did was look at the impact factor of the journals in which men and women were publishing. Now, there are many concerns with the impact factor, and I could do an entire talk on that. But we can use that as a sort of selection mechanism. We know that as the impact factor goes up for a journal, their acceptance rate goes down. So if we think about acceptance as a criteria for quality, what we actually see is that in many disciplines, earth and space science, biology, engineering, and social sciences, women are placing their work in journals of higher impact factor than their male colleagues. Yet even in those places, their work is getting cited at a lower degree. Now, this is more pronounced for first authors, which are usually our junior authors, our postdocs, our doctoral students, but we see the same lingering effects in our last author or more senior authors there, where there's a discrepancy from the rate at which they're getting published in certain journals and then the consumption of those publications by the scientific community. Now, to deal with the skewness, we also looked at this by deciles of impact factor. And at the lowest rate, there's very little difference. Men's work is cited slightly more than women's work in journals of the same decile of impact factor. But what is shocking to me is that the gap grows larger and larger as we move up in those deciles, which means that it is precisely at the top in the elite journals, in those journals with the highest impact factor, that we see the largest gap in the average relative citation rate received. Now, this is controlling for discipline. This is controlling for all of those factors, time and discipline. We're seeing this huge gap. So when women are publishing their work in Science and Nature and PNAS, when they are making it through that selection mechanism, which should be a control for quality, we are still seeing a decline in the amount of citations that they receive. Now, this is exacerbated by the intersection between race and gender. So this paper that we're working on right now looks at the likelihood that a surname is associated with race. And I won't go into all the methods here, but happy to talk about those in the Q&A session. But essentially, we take the U.S. Census data and articles just written within the U.S., and we look at the proportion of those surnames that are associated with particular races. And what you can see here is that in every single race, women's work is cited at a lower rate on average than males of the same race or ethnicity. But what is shocking to me is what happens when those names are highly indicative of a Black or Hispanic author. So if you look at the male category for each of those under Black and Hispanic, what you see is when a name is 90 to 100% associated with a Black or Hispanic male, those citation rates also drop dramatically, which shows that there is a gender dimension here, but there is also a race dimension. And if you are a woman of color working within science, your citation rates are going to take a dramatic hit. So any evaluation system that assumes a meritocracy here is going to be highly problematic for employment. Deem. Now, I might stop for a quick minute to see if there are any questions, if Chris or Yaling wants to bring questions from the chat.
Hi, Cassidy. So far, we don't have any questions except to know if you're going to share the slides.
Yeah, happy to share the slides. Definitely into open science. So please let me know, and we can share them to all the attendees. I can also share them individually. Feel free to email.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So a problem with all of this, and for using Bibliometrics, is that in many times the authorship fails to capture labor, to really understand what someone did to warrant authorship on that particular piece. So there have been new forms of attribution that are coming out. Now, in a lot of ways, these are not a replacement to, but a supplement to many of the authorship forms that we already know. So for example, in PLOS, you'll see the list of the authors, and the order implies some sort of hierarchy, which we can talk about later. But then we also see the contributorship. Who did what? What merited authorship on that paper? And then, of course, we have our sub-authors, those people who did some labor, but not enough to warrant authorship. So there's many things happening here in the construction of scientific articles, and understanding the labor that goes into that and how we reward the labor becomes really important. So here's a description of the data, and I will say that this data came before the credit taxonomy was adopted by PLOS. So at that time, people were providing their labor contributions in very idiosyncratic ways. So these idiosyncratic ways, we sort of merged them all up, pulled through all of these data in these XML files, and came up with 5 main categories: analyzing the data, conceiving and designing the experiments, contributing reagents, tools, and remember that much of PLOS is biomedical, performing the experiments, and writing the papers. Now, what I find fascinating, and we won't go into in this talk, but there were more than 20,000 other individual labor tasks that were not captured by those, appearing in about 20% of the papers. So about 1/5 of the papers had some sort of labor that didn't fall into that, which shows you the highly heterogeneous nature of scientific production, and so much of this labor that is not captured in the way we typically conceive of the scientific method and the process of science. So I will talk more about the labor contributions. But as you see, most of the papers had one of these 5 categories. So one of the things we did is look to see how these were related. What are you likely to do in conjunction? When you're analyzing the data, are you also likely to do something else? And what we found was among all of these things, the performing of the experimentation was the most isolated category. When you were performing the experiment, you were unlikely to be doing anything else. Now, once we start talking about fraud and reproducibility, I find this highly problematic, that the people who are conceiving or designing the study, people who are analyzing the data or writing the paper, are not those performing the experiments. And vice versa, those performing the experiments are not engaged in those other tasks of presenting the scientific work to the community. And that provides, I think, a lot of space for misconduct, whether intentional or unintentional. But if we return to the gender lens, we see something quite interesting. That if we take all of these tasks and we control for collaboration teams and discipline and country, what we find is that the odds of females likely to do the task is lower in each case. Men are likely to be designed to provide materials and to write the paper. The one task that women are disproportionately associated is performing the experimentation. Now remember, that's also the task that's the most isolated. So we have a system in which a certain population of scientific workers is being assigned a task in isolation from the rest of the tasks. That task is also relegated to certain authorship positions, particularly middle authors. Now, many of you may say, well, that's because women are more junior. We only have 20 to 25% of our full professors or our senior professors are women. So over time, that will change. But this controls for age as well. Even women in senior positions were disproportionately likely to be engaged in the experimentation relative to their male counterparts. Now, we've updated these data to look at the credit taxonomy, which has been in effect for a couple of years at PLOS and is now adopted by, I believe, about 200 different journals. And here something striking comes out. If we just look at the percentage of authors that are male or female associated with these tasks, I will read for you those which men are more likely to do. Supervise, acquisition, resources, conceptualization, software. And now the writing is split into two things. Rather than one category for writing, we have writing, reviewing, and editing versus writing original drafts. And men are more likely to do some editing and administration and validation. Now here's what women are more likely to do. The methods, the visualization, the analysis, writing the whole paper, doing the data curation, and the investigation. Now to me, this is quite striking because when we start talking about gender disparities, that first blue map, you see this overwhelmingly male-dominated profession. Yet when you look into the paper, you look into the labor, women are doing the work of science, the methods, the visualization, the analysis, writing, the curation, and the investigation. Yet their work is often relegated to authorship positions that don't reflect their contributions to the work. Any questions before we go on?
Yes, Cassidy. There are actually a lot of questions about the methods about how you found or how you did the gender differences in using the names. Like the first one is about talking about the methods identifying the gender, and then how do you do the control for married people who kind of change their last name or associated with specific ethnic or race group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So two different things for the gender and then the race. So I'll do both of them. So for the gender disambiguation assignment, we use a combination of sources. So we take the U.S. Census data, which looks at the proportion of a given name, so a first name that is associated with a certain gender. And so we take a certain threshold on that. For our disambiguation algorithm, we also use many country-based lists. And so we take into account the affiliation of the authors as well, so that a Jean in France will be male, whereas a Jean in the United States will be female. For Soviet and former Soviet countries, we actually do use the surname because we have the ov and the ova, which become indicative of gender for those countries. We've done manual disambiguation, particularly for Asian names, to raise our validity on those, which were fairly poor just using the census level data. So we had native speakers coding through those as well. And we've done several rounds of validation through that gender disambiguation algorithm. So of course, there are several limitations of it. It's better for Western countries than for Asian countries, even with all of the validation work. There are also issues of finding it with a gender binary, so that becomes problematic as well. And what we often say when we're looking at this is they are perceptions of gender. Right? These are not gender identities, but these are perceptions of gender by those who are citing or reading or consuming the work. So I think that becomes an important distinction to make here. Now, the race data is a really interesting thing in that it's using surnames. We have begun a validation project for that. So, of course, marriage is an issue. Also, location is an issue. So the surname Washington, for example, has a high probability of being associated with someone who is Black in the U.S. Census. But our assessment is that probably differs dramatically by the state, by the population size, and there are many things to think about there. Also, the threshold of names that make it into Hispanic, Black, or Native American in these is much lower than for our white names. So we're doing a lot of validation on that. So this is really work in progress on that. You'll see if you look at Lisa's work, and others also use the same surname approach using the U.S. Census data. So this is an approach that has been used and validated before, but we're still working on trying to understand the limitations a little bit better on that.
Two more questions about last names. How do you do with compound last names and also with only publishing with their initials instead of their full name?
Yeah, good questions. So on this, the compound last names would be included if they're in the U.S. Census. So if you use those, they are included in that. If it If it is something that has been hyphenated, so it is not a traditionally compound last name, then it's likely to be unknown. And so there are a series of unknown names. Not all names have a race assignment within U.S. Census that reaches a threshold that we could use. So it has to have a certain population for us to use it. In terms of initials, that's a really interesting question. So for initials for gender, we tested that because our hypothesis is that women might be more likely to use initials in order to mask their gender identity, and we found the opposite. The reason is really driven by math and physics. So certain disciplines that disproportionately use initials are disciplines that are male-dominated, like math and physics. And so we've done tests on those. And so our manual validation of this often uses the article to go search and find the person, to find either pronouns in a biography or a visual image that is indicative of gender in order to see if our assignation was correct.
There's one comment. So it's interesting to those of us in the medical library following the discussion and advocating for authorship in systematic reviews.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And I think, for the medical community, they were some of the first to adopt the contributorship. So contributorship was a concept put forward within the medical community. So Rennie and others were working towards that, and it was adopted by BMJ. It was adopted by other journals. The problem is that contributorship was largely embedded within PDFs. So when journal editors when publishers choose to put them in that way, it becomes very hard to mine them. So the first really mineable data set was PLOS because they were putting it in XML format. So there are many other journals that have adopted this approach, but they are hidden and masked. And so I would love to see them be more transparent as more publishers are moving to online format. Any other questions?
That's all for now.
Okay. So looking at those kinds of issues, when we look at the publication, we look at the laborer distribution, again, one of the problems is we are still relying on unobtrusive data, and unobtrusive data can only get us so far. So in my work, I love to triangulate with other sources of data to understand how people are thinking about the data that we're seeing. So in one of our surveys that we did, we surveyed about 11,000. We had 11,000 responses, but only about 5,300 had all of our relevant variables, which was gender, rank, discipline, number of collaboratively authored publications. And we ran a bunch of regressions on it, and controlling for all the variables, women were significantly more likely to report authored disputes than men, and to have them more frequently than men did. So we asked them, well, what contributed to the disagreement? Why did you disagree on either authorship naming or ordering? Men and women said the same thing, that we have different ways of valuing the importance of the contribution. And I found this really fascinating. The authors didn't agree on what was valuable, what kind of labor was important in the scientific work. So we asked them, all right, what do you value? And what was absolutely fascinating is two things. Women valued everything more than men. So on a Likert type scale, we said, how much do you value study design? And women said, oh, that's much more important than men said it was. Literature review, oh, that's very important. Data collection, data analysis, writing it, these all were very important things. The one task that men placed as more valuable than women was technical work, which is the one thing with which women were disproportionately associated. So this becomes a really interesting psychological dilemma around mentoring, is that we often think of women being relegated to certain roles or women not being acknowledged for their labor, but there is also a part of this where women are not assessing the value of their own contribution. And when they are not doing that, they are less likely to advocate for themselves on a paper, to advocate for different kinds of labor roles, if they are not understanding the value that they are providing to this paper itself. So really interesting to understand their perceptions of these values. Any questions on that before I go on?
No? Please move on.
Please move on. So one of the things that really interests me is the role of funding. So for the last 2 years, I served as the program director for the Science of Science program at the National Science Foundation. And so I thought a lot about how we can mitigate some of these disparities if we are looking at the role of funding. So I'll give a brief analysis of what funding looks like using a data set that focuses only on U.S. professors within academic analytics. And so one of the things we looked at here was the proportion of male or female faculty who held at least one grant. So just binary. Do you have any grants or not? And what you can see here is that in the medical sciences, men were more likely to hold a grant than women. But in engineering, women were actually more likely to hold a grant than men. Now, the difference is, though, when you look at it not in who's holding a grant, but in the amount that they receive. So even though women were receiving more grants in engineering, they were receiving, on average, much smaller grants. And the high skew, those $7, $8, $9 million grants, were going disproportionately to men. And we can see that across all of the disciplines. Those big, large centers, those large consortia, the huge funding amounts are going to men rather than women, which changes the structure of what they can do, the way in which they can hire postdocs, how they can engage a larger team. Again, back to that mobility and national and international ability is going to be driven by their ability to secure those kinds of funds. Now, one thing that interests us was how has it changed over time, right? Is it the more senior or the younger faculty that are seeing these disparities? And it's fairly disheartening to see that it's actually the younger faculty. So for those who received a PhD before 1975, there are fairly equal rates of receipts of grants by men and women. Now, we can look at this as a selection effect. Women who received grants at equal rates to men have probably stayed in the scientific workforce longer. But if we start moving for those who received degrees around 1980, 90, or 2000, and we get to the most current decade, is where we see some of the biggest gaps between male and female receipts of. Now, what worries me about this is that this could be an indicator, an early indicator of potential attrition. When women aren't receiving the grants necessary to run their labs, to recruit postdocs and doctoral students, and to work in large collaborative groups, they may be more likely to leave science. Now, of course, it's different by different disciplines. So, for example, in the natural sciences, the younger faculty are receiving grants at rates fairly similar to their male counterparts, but it is in the medical sciences where we see the biggest discrepancy. So I think that it's really important for those on the line here, this particular audience and group of attendees and hosts, to think more critically about the implications of this. So getting a grant is one thing, right? That is an input mechanism. But in order to get to that output mechanism, to get to those publications, we have to go through the gatekeeping process. And so one of the things that we've done is looked at the peer review process as a mechanism for perpetuating some of these disparities. So we took eLife as a really interesting case. And what I like about eLife is a couple things. One, it has a really nice origin story. So you have a prize winner who said, okay, what am I going to do with my prize money? Well, I'll start a new journal because I think the scholarly communication system is fairly broken and I would like to reimagine it. And one of the ways in which this was reimagined was in how we did peer review. And so what he wanted to do was move towards consultative peer review. So rather than me sending out an article as an editor to 3 different reviewers, then reading those independently and making my own recommendation and judgment, rather all the reviewers are in consultation with each other. They have a conversation. So they review it, they each sort of present their cases, and then they debate. And they say, well, actually, I didn't have a problem with that. Or yes, I agree, that statistical approach is incorrect. Or no, I think that's a subjective assessment. And so at the end, what someone gets when they are required to do a revision is one consensus report that smooths over all of those differences between the reviewers and presents a consolidated conversation for the authors. So here just provides the kind of idea here. One of the things they do is go through an encouragement session, and that is essentially your desk reject. So whether you are encouraged to submit a full paper or not. Now, if you're encouraged, about 50% go to revision, and most of those, about 70% of those, end up being accepted. So there's a huge cutoff in terms of just that encouragement rate before we even get to the review process. Now, we see here a lot of the same outcomes by gender that we see in other places. Men submit more than women. And many times that's used as the end of the conversation. The reason there are disparities is because men are submitting more. But when we go to that encouragement rate, there is a slight but significant difference between male encouragement and females, with male being encouraged more often. And then for corresponding and last authors, male are accepted more often, which leads to an overall acceptance rate that's higher for men. Now, you may look at that and say, oh, well, that's just a couple percentage points. But that proportional difference is actually quite large, and that compounds over time. The best predictor of a publication is having a previous publication. The best predictor of a grant is having a previous grant and previous publications. So that cumulative effect begins to roll again and again. So only a couple percentage points over a long time can have huge effects on the scientific system. Now, if you look at this, we can see that our corresponding and our last authors are where we're seeing the greatest discrepancy, and very little for their first authors or more junior authors, which shows a lot of this is based around those senior authors rather than the younger ones. We can also see that the corresponding and last authors are the ones who look the most like our gatekeepers. So when we think about peer review, we think you're being reviewed by your peers, but in many cases, you're not. There's a difference between who's reviewing you and who the author pool is. Now, this is true for gender, but it's also true for country level. So, for example, you're much more likely to have a gatekeeper from North America or Europe than to be an author from North America or Europe. You're also more likely to have a gatekeeper who's male than to be an author who is male. And that composition of those teams has significant effects on the outcome by gender. So one of the things we wanted to look at was that profile of the entire team. And now in the case when you have all male reviewers, men are significantly more likely to be accepted than women. Now, if you look at the other case, all female reviewers, the striking thing to notice here is that it's almost an exact inversion of the all reviewers, with females being more likely to be accepted than males. Now, this is not significant. And why? Well, because there's only 21 papers in the entire corpus that had a female lead author and all female reviewers. If you were to increase the size, we may see greater significance. Now, neither one of those are good situations, right? We don't want to see any gender being favored over the other. Now, what happens when we have mixed gender reviews? It disappears. There is no greater outcome for men or women at a significant level there, and it mitigates some of those biases that we can see. We do the same exact thing when we look at the country level data. Having a reviewer from China increases the likelihood that someone from China is accepted. Having a reviewer from South America also changes the outcomes there. And so what this suggests is that there is homophily in that peer review space. And now that homophily can be used both to mitigate and create disparities. But simply put, you are disproportionately likely to be a man with a male reviewer or to be North American with a North American reviewer than any of those cases. And so creating diversity in the composition of your peer review team can lead to more equitable outcomes. Now, if we take all of the variables for eLife and we look at your odds of acceptance, here's what we find. The best way to get through the door is being from a top institution and being male. Everything else is likely to decrease your odds of being accepted. Now, once you get through that process and you go through revision, you should still be from a top institution. You should be male, and all your reviewers should be male as well. Now, this points to a system that is not meritocratic. This points to a system where socio-demographic variables are having a much stronger effect than they should in the gatekeeping process. Any questions on that before we go on?
Yes, we have a few questions. So the first one is that what is the gender aspect in retracted papers?
That is a great question. I have seen one study. I have not done a study on that, but what I have seen is that incidents of fraud and misconduct generally, and I'm not sure about retraction specifically, are higher for men than for women, and proportionally, not in raw number, because obviously we would expect the raw number to be higher. But I'd have to go find that article and send that out. Okay.
Another one, do you think this type of analysis is possible at institutional level?
Sorry, you cut out for a second. What was the question?
The question is, do you think this type of analysis is possible at the institutional level?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So both, and I'm not sure which of the analyses, but we've done these analyses for funding, for production, for citation, all at the institutional level. And one of the things, we have a blog post that takes the Leiden rankings, which has the institutional level, and we look at the gender disparities by institution. And we also create an expected level of gender disparities based on the disciplinary profile of those institutions. So, for example, a program that has a large engineering program, we would expect to have lower rates of women than something that has a large nursing or social work program. And so even looking at that, we can see how much people are deviating from what would be expected given global rates. So yes, the institutional level is possible. From a bibliometric perspective, I'll just say that it takes a lot more cleaning, but that cleaning is possible, and a lot of the larger institutions have done it.
Regarding authorships, do you have a sense from your research that any gender differences between the amount of work necessary to be considered as a co-author versus as an acknowledged contributor?
Yes, that is a question that we ask all the time and we're asked all the time. And we don't have, what we have is all anecdotal. So in that survey that I spoke about before, we had thousands of open-ended responses. We thought, we'd get a handful, so we left an open-ended question at the end, and we had thousands. And the anecdotal stories talk about that, about all of the labor that they put into it, and then someone walking in at the last minute and becoming an author, or about friends of the senior author getting on with no more than presence on the conference calls rather than any kind of labor. So there is a perception, particularly among female academics, that the labor burden, the sort of threshold for authorship requires a higher labor burden for women and for junior scholars than for senior and male scholars.
Okay, I think this question is about the part when you talk about grant and grant review. So the question is, could the percentage difference in encouragement be a factor of the large difference in submission numbers?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a huge point. So yes, I will say I think it does. I think it creates a path dependency. And there's another study which I didn't present here, and now I'm regretting it. But we looked at people who had submitted really high-performing papers, and we asked them where they had submitted or how they had decided to. And women were more likely to say that they never submitted it to the highly elite journals because they didn't think that it was appropriate or it would fit, whereas men were going that avenue more likely. So I think that there is a self-selection mechanism that is created after rejection, where women begin to think that their work belongs in certain kinds of venues or is perhaps not of good enough quality to go into those. So yes, I think it certainly creates a path dependency.
Thank you. I think we're good for now.
Okay. So moving on to parenting. So of course, as we dig into all of these issues, people say, okay, but you're trying to solve a problem, that is a social problem, with scientific data. And what we have to look at is not just how funding or publication or incentives draw some of this, but what's happening in the home, what's happening in other spaces that may be contributing to some of these disparities that we see. And we come again and again to the issue of caregiving. And so we've done a study on caregiving, and I find the results actually quite interesting. So we took about 1.5 million first and last authors who had published at least one article over the last decade. And we received a stunning 17,519 respondents. Now, we took all of those, removed incomplete cases, those who didn't list whether or not they had children or the ages of the children, and we removed other gender, and I will only say that that was because of a statistical necessity. The N was so small, and using any other kind of data, such as affiliation or discipline, would have become identifying for it. And so we removed that for privacy concerns as well. And then we linked that to the CWTS data, which has disambiguated author profiles. And we had about 10,000 different authors. Now, unlike other studies that we've done, we had a slightly higher proportion of female respondents, so closer to 40-45% of our respondents were female, which is higher than we would expect given the population. But we still had a sizable amount of male authors too, and that was really important to us because what we wanted to see was the effect of parenting and whether that was gender related or not. So we did not want to exclude our male parents from this study. So the first thing that we did was try to identify who was serving in a lead parenting role, that is, serving as the primary caregiver. So we asked several questions, and the respondents were able to self-identify. Do they do the primary caregiving? Do they share equal parenting, or do they think that their partner or someone else, a grandparent, a hired individual, is serving as the primary caregiver. Now, part of this is expected and part's unexpected. Women were disproportionately likely to be serving in a lead parenting role, whereas men were more likely to be serving in the satellite parenting role. But the modal response was actually dual parenting. Most of the scientists that were responding to the survey said, I share equal parenting roles with my spouse. And I will also mention that these were all heterosexual couples in this analysis. We were really hoping we would be able to explore other kinds of family profiles, but the amount of respondents that were homosexual was, again, too small of an N to include in the analysis. So one of the things that we looked at was the time of day that they were investing as the primary caregiver. So remember that the modal amount was dual. But then we asked, okay, so who's really on duty from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m.? And it was women. And weekdays from 9 to 5, women. Weekdays from 5 to 8, women. And we found that across all of the time periods, women were more likely to identify themselves as the primary caregiver during those times. So we thought, all right, well, we have to explain this dual parenting somehow. Maybe it's the kind of tasks that they're doing rather than the time of day at which they're serving as a primary caregiver. We also looked to see whether this was happening because of the dual lead and satellite parenting. And what we started to find, and it's a little bit difficult to see in this chart, is that category of me, the time that I'm invested by whether I'm a satellite or dual or a lead parent. And in most cases, we're more likely to be serving in a dominant role when a satellite or when a dual parenting than men. And so in many of these cases, even though they're claiming dual parenting, it appeared as if women were doing a disproportionate amount of domestic labor. Now, as I mentioned, we looked at all of these activities. So we looked at dozens of activities. Do you cook the dinners? Do you go grocery shopping? Do you schedule play dates? Do you read bedtime stories? And what we found was in every case, women were more likely to state that they were the primary caregiver except for one. And that was, if you want to get a minute to guess, coaching sporting events. So that was the one activity in which men, male scientists, were more likely to be engaged in that activity than female scientists. Now, one of the fascinating parts was that we had about 3,000 respondents who were in academic couples. That is, both the respondent and the respondent's spouse were in academic roles. So they were both employed as academics at academic institutions. So we took only those academic couples who had stated that they had dual shared parenting. That is where they said, yes, we share equal responsibility in parenting. And then we asked them two questions. My partner takes on the majority of childcare, so I can focus on my career. And women were disproportionately less likely to say that they did that, and men said, yes, my partner takes on the majority of childcare so I can focus on my career. And then we switched it and said, I take the majority of childcare so my partner can focus on their career. And we see the same kinds of responses. So even in a shared parenting role, in an academic couple, where the labor expectation, the professional labor expectation is the same for both of the partners, women were disproportionately more likely to be focusing on the childcare duties so that the partner could take a leading role professionally. So we wanted to look at the effect that that had on all of these bibliometric indicators that we use. And what we found was that there is a parenting penalty, and that parenting penalty affected both men and women alike. When you were serving in a lead parenting role, your total number of productions was lower than the global rates and lower than what we would expect. And that increases slightly with dual and shared parenting, and it increases with satellite parenting. But in each role, women took a harder hit than men. What I attribute this to is not as much a gender issue, but a time issue. As we saw before in the previous slide, women, even when they were stating they were doing dual work, were taking on a disproportionate amount of labor in each of these categories. Now, one of the things that's always suggested as an outcome is that we should provide better parental leaves. But there was actually a penalty for parental leaves as well. So in the first thing, not taking a leave had a hit on your career, but then the longer that your leave was, the less productive of a scientist you are. Now that, again, the penalty affected men and women alike. But the difference is women were disproportionately more likely to take leave and to take longer leaves than their male counterparts. And the last thing that we looked at were significant predictors of impact. And here are the things that we found were significantly more likely, controlling for everything else, to increase your impact. Being male, taking a short parental leave, having your partner coordinate play dates, don't be religious, don't celebrate any holidays, and travel. Be gone as much as possible. Things bad for your impact, having more than children, taking a longer parental leave, being a primary or equal caregiver, helping your kids with extracurricular, and then any of the variables that we associate with having young children, drop off at nursery, breastfeeding, putting kids to bed, bedtime stories, all of those things were lower in terms of your impact. And what we see here is, of course, not as simplistic that being a parent makes your work lower quality, but being a parent, particularly of young children, who is not traveling as much, is going to limit your visibility in terms of the scientific space. And if you become invisible because of these children, you're taking long parental leaves, you're dealing with younger children who need a lot of physical attention, you're not traveling, you're not going to conferences, and your invisibility in the scientific sphere is going to have effects on your citation. Now, of course, there's also cumulative effect that if it's affected your production has an impact on your citation receipt. And so what we see here really is a play on that parenting penalty and how it's leading to some of these disparities that we observe within the broader production space. Any questions before we go on to the last section?
We're good.
Okay. No questions? All right. So, of course, we were finishing up this parenting study, and then the pandemic hit. And so, of course, all of this really resonated with us. We were reading through these thousands of anecdotal responses for these women who had these disproportionate care responsibilities. And in the same moment, children were all sent home from school. And men and women alike were working from home. And so, of course, the hypothesis was, driven by our data, is that if women were in the home with their children, they were disproportionately likely to be engaging in those care activities, and therefore we might be able to see an effect of the pandemic on their production. So we took over 300,000 preprints and reports that represent about 1.3 million authors. So we took both registered reports and preprints. And our idea was to try to look at things in a timely manner. What was happening right now? So the publication lags would be too long. But we wanted to understand really who is submitting research, who is registering new research, how are people producing research within the time of the pandemic. And if we just look at some of the big preprint servers, bioRxiv, and arXiv from last year to this year, we see that arXiv was actually fairly stable. It had no visible hit in the initial months of the pandemic in North America. But we see bioRxiv has some wavering for first authors, but medRxiv sees the strongest decline, where it drops dramatically during the pandemic. Now, we can look at this between first and last authors, which again gives us a different thing. First authors, we may hypothesize, would be disproportionately likely to have children and young children at home. And medRxiv certainly had a huge decline in those first authors, one that was much larger than the decline that we see in last authors. And last authors seem to recover at a quicker rate than our first authors. Now, we made a real-time tracking app. So if you want to see some updated data on this, you can go to this app. It's still running, and it's constantly surveying all of these preprints and these registered reports. Because, of course, this is not something that's only going to happen in 1 month. The pandemic effect are going to have lingering long-term consequences. Many women who were on sabbaticals had those cut short. Who were doing field work have it cut short. Those who were supposed to be in the lab and their lab was shut down have that cut short. And we won't be able to see that in immediate time, but we're going to see that in terms of publication lags or a change in topic over time. And so that lag becomes something that I think is really important for us to watch as we move forward, particularly as many evaluation systems are going to be judging people on the output of the last 3 to 5 years. Now, we can see this is updated through June. And one of the interesting things that we see is that lag that is appearing particularly in the social sciences. So in the early months, in March and April, the NBER preprints really didn't see that huge of a dip, but we saw a huge dip come summer. We're also seeing a larger dip for the sciences than we're seeing even in the biomedical sciences, which shows that sort of recency effect and the time delays in certain disciplines. Now, the other things that we looked at was the female participation in COVID research itself. So how much are women identifying and working on this particular topic, this moment right now? And what we found is that men were disproportionately more likely to be doing COVID-related research than women were. And so, again, women were not engaging in the contemporary issue, and our hypothesis is that that was related to their parenting responsibilities. Now, I think I saw something in the chat just come up as I was going, how is this related to parenting? Our studies were only looking at the proportions. We weren't doing a survey, but there's been a fabulous survey that's been done by Dashan Wang and his group and other groups that have been tying this explicitly to the to parenting and other caregiving responsibilities. Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, there are actually some comments and questions. So the major one is that, did you find any examples in your study of individuals that were active parents and also highly productive scientists?
Yes, so absolutely. And one of my favorite, I keep a lot of these quotes from the open-ended, and a lot of my favorite quotes were particularly women who wrote and said, I have never been as productive as having a child. It makes me organize my time in really structured ways. And I used to waste so much more time before, but now I know I have an hour and a half while the baby is down, and so I'm going to get something done. And there are a lot of stories like that that actually talk about their experience in balancing these things, or in the initiatives that many conferences and other things are taking to provide childcare opportunities, and how different it is now than it was before. Some of our respondents had children that were much older, and so they were responding to the changing nature of the system between what they experienced and how much child rearing was looked down upon when they had children, and how much more accessible it is today. So there are happy stories in it too. I'm sorry my talk is so depressing, but there are definitely good stories. Anything else, Yali?
No, most of them are comments. I believe you will have time to read them later.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's get to the final question, which is, does this matter? Who cares if men or women are doing studies, if someone who's black or white? Why does it matter? Why should we care who's doing scientific work and how they are leaving the science? So I'll move to a paper that we published last year in Lancet, which looks at a slightly different angle on this study. So we start by looking at gender as the object of study, and that is to look at whether male or female, whether sex is taken into account as an analytic variable, whether it's analyzed and reported, and whether men and female are included as populations within the study. Now, as you can see, this is increasing in public health dramatically. So both sexes being taken into account in it and reported in the study. It's increasing in clinical medicine as well, largely, I would argue, as a result of the NIH policy requiring both sexes to be taken into account, sex to be taken into account as an analytical variable, unless extreme justification could be provided not to. What I find more problematic is how the majority of biomedical research still does not take sex into account as an analytic variable. Now, as I'm sure many of these attendees will know better than I do, the sex of the cell matters. It matters in the absorption of lipids. It matters in its stress response. And this is largely why that 7 out of 10 drugs drawn from the market are drawn because they have adverse effects for women, because it wasn't tested on women. And we're not testing drugs on women. We are unlikely to be prescribing drugs for women at equitable rates. And so the way in which we're doing science has implications for the consumption of that science and the public health issues around that science. Now, if we look at this by the subject, you see some things that are expected. We're more likely to look at female-only populations in obstetrics and gynecology. We're more likely to see male-only populations in urology. These things make sense. But why are we focusing so much on men in pharmacy? Why are we looking at men in pharmacology disproportionately? And so as we look through these areas, we see that physiology, pharmacology, pharmacy, dermatology, were focused more on male populations in the studies than on female populations. So what we did is we took this and then we overlaid it with our gender assignation on the authors. And what we found was fascinating, that when you had a female in last author role or a female in first author role, and particularly when you had women both in first and last author role, you were disproportionately likely to take sex into account and to include women in the study. So simply put, having females as biomedical researchers increases what we know about women. And given that women are 50% of the population and 100% of the birthing population, that seems relatively important. And we're starting to see this as we look through our race and ethnicity data as well, that there are different topics that are studied and explored by different populations relative to their interests, their context, their culture. And all of those things come into play in what we know about the world. How we're framing scientific questions, the questions that we think are important, are going to be largely driven by who's asking the questions. So in order to have a rigorous and effective scientific system, we need to look at diversity in the scientific workforce. So I'll end with this. What can we do? So knowing this, where do we go? And here's my last slide, and I would love to just sort of keep this up for questions and comments as we move forward. But I think that there's a lot that each of the actors in the scholarly communication and scientific community can do. So institutions and funders, I will say, and I'm happy to discuss this ad nauseum, is that I believe in quotas. I would love to live in a world where we don't need them, but I think we need them right now. Representation matters, and having women and people of color at higher echelons within the scientific workforce changes our ability to recruit and retain a diverse scientific workforce. So I think quotas are important, and I think they're effective. I think we need to think about maternity resources rather than maternity leaves. So often our way of dealing with women is to make them more invisible rather than giving them greater visibility. We put them on leaves, we extend their leaves, we allow them to take extra leaves, we tell them to stop the clock, we delay their clock, and each of these things moves them further and further from the core of scientific work. But thinking about maternity resources creatively can allow us to say, give women a postdoc when they have children, allow them to continue to engage in science, to create better services around childcare at conferences and other events so that women can engage both in their caregiving and their professional responsibilities. This requires reimagining the ideal scientific workforce and not imagining that ideal scientific worker as being a childless male senior academic. We need to think about resources to allow for mobility. The lack of female mobility impacts all of these measures that we look at. And one thing that we haven't looked at here today is harassment. And certainly we cannot just keep putting women into a climate that is hostile to them. So we have to look at the culture and the climate of academic and scientific work in order to retain and recruit a more diverse scientific population. I think that publishers can do a lot more in making peer review transparent. And I think that transparency will lead to better equity. I think we need more accountability in authorship to remove all of the honorific authorship, to understand the labor contributions to authorship and reward it equitably. I think we need to think about fair open access policies. My concern has always been with the open access movement is that we think a lot about access for readers, but we don't often think about access for authors. And as we move more towards a gold open access space with high APCs, we're going to disadvantage certain populations who are less likely to have research funding and other resources, which falls disproportionately on certain populations. I think also, and I'd like to end with this, that research has a responsibility, and perhaps the most important responsibility. It's so easy to say, yeah, institutions and publishers should fix this. They're the cause of the problem. But the cause of the problem is in how we recruit individuals, how we provide them with certain resources, how we mentor those in our lab, the kind of labor practices that we instill within our scientific practice, how we communicate about authorship. All of those creates these patterns that contribute to these disparities. Science isn't something happening outside of us. It's something that we are enacting. And so we have to take our own responsibility for these disparities in order to end them. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to take any questions that people may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. I'll throw in one question. Okay, so the question from the audience is that, do you have any suggestions for university administrators on how to design or help or support now during the pandemic? I have had questions recently about how to help researchers, especially pre-tenure researchers during the pandemic. So is there science of a science research that could inform or maybe gut instinct about what to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did mention Dashan Wang's study on this. We have a study, Jens Peter Andersen. There are several studies that sort of show the effects of this and describe them. They don't test for policy relevant examples. So right now, I think we're in a space where we have to look at that data and come up with policy examples. One thing I would say is I would discourage from an approach that is stopping the tenure clock. I think that that is really problematic, and what it does is it takes already vulnerable populations and extends their periods of vulnerability. And by that, I mean their salary is lower for a longer period of time. They're also in a state of anxiety for a longer period of time. And they do not internalize a lower degree of expectation for that extra year. They're going to assume that they need to produce more in that extra year. So it's not really taking into account that they are having disproportionate burdens during this pandemic. What I would love to see is we change the evaluation criteria for promotion and tenure during this time, that we look at our evaluation criteria and acknowledge that there is a pandemic happening and that a disproportionate labor burden is being placed on those participants. So we should look at their past achievements and be able to advance them and advance their careers. I think we have to be, I would love for institutions to think more carefully about what we're dealing with those who are graduating this year in a very poor labor market, and maybe creating more postdoctoral opportunities. So my dream thing is that institutions would say, all right, those who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, whether they're women, people of color, single dads, each of these people, we're going to actually try to give them postdocs, and we're going to give them postdocs from some of these vulnerable populations so that those participants can have better resources to stay active in science and to stay engaged in science so that we don't have a huge loss of junior researchers during this time. I think we also have to think of a lot of other resources that we give them and think more creatively about resources, whether it's signing them up for meal services or childcare where appropriate during the pandemic, are the kinds of things that they need. They need resources to allow them to continue their research, not to stay further away from it.
Thank you so much, Cassidy. I'll have to direct you to our chat because there are so many questions out there, and we'll have to move on. Thank you. Thank you again for the fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again very much. That was fantastic. So we are going to now move on. Again, we'll keep the chat box open and the questions open, so please feel free to keep the conversations going there and also in the Slack channels. So thank you once again. We are going to take a short, maybe 5 to 6 minute break, and we're going to reconvene at 15 past the hour. Thanks again, everyone.